Hello, everybody, and welcome to this inaugural TDR webinar. We're delighted to have you here with us and hope that you can join us for this series. Hosting this evening is Richard Schechner, who needs no introduction, but is TDR's renowned editor-in-chief, as well as a professor at the Tisch School of the Arts with NYU. I am going to hand over to Richard and look forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Christian. Hello, Gary. Hello, Weston. So we have a very distinguished couple of guests. So let me briefly introduce them. Gary Allen Fine, he's on there you are, is the James E. Johnson Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University, where he focuses on the sociology of the arts, culture, play, and collective memory. His current interest is in the political reputations, examining the reputations of Southern politicians, including George Wallace, Strom Thurmond, and Hugo Black. Now, you don't know who these people are, perhaps during the conversation, Gary will illuminate us, but they're in line with the basic subject we're going to be discussing, which is Southern populist politicians. He's also written on, quote, despised presidents, unquote, including focusing on Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. I could think of a edition maybe down the line sometime. In this light, Fine is the author of Difficult Reputations, Collective Memories of the Evil, Inept, and Controversial. He has served as the director of the interdisciplinary PhD program in theater and drama at Northwestern. And earlier, Fine was a professional theater critic in Philadelphia. He's also written previously for TDR back in ancient times. Weston Twardowski is earning his an interdisciplinary PhD in theater and drama at Northwestern University. His areas of study include performance, theater, race, memory, and environmental justice. I would call that a performance studies degree, actually, but we won't argue about that. His dissertation focuses on performance as a tool of spiritual survival and political activism in post-Katrina New Orleans, the city where TDR started, more or less. It started in Minnesota and moved to New Orleans shortly after its beginning. Weston is also a professional director and dramaturg, a co-founder and literary manager of Third Culture Theater in Los Angeles. All right, let me launch this by asking you both a question. And let's Gary talk first, and then Weston, and then have a conversation. Why should today we know about these three Southern US politicians, Eugene Talmadge, Theodore Bilbo, Huey Long, who were active nearly a century ago? Why now for politicians who were active, 80, 90 years ago?
Thank you, Richard. Let me begin by just mentioning that I have read TDR from the days that it was the Tulane Drama Review, and back in the 1960s. And today is special because this is a new chapter for TDR as it is being published now by University Press. So this is kind of exciting. Now, in answer to your question, populism has been part of American society, certainly for the past 125 years. And it's an important part. It's both a positive element. It involves incorporating working class people into the political process, and that's good. But it's also in some ways dangerous as well, because it can become nationalistic. It can become a means of separating segments of society. And we see that in terms of the current era, the Trump presidency, the way in which the Republican Party has become more of a party of working class people than it had been decades ago, but also the various noxious elements that we see the isolationism, the racism, and so forth. That is also part of a populist tradition. Now, going back to these Southern politicians, we can see that populism at work. We can see that, for example, Huey Long, the great senator from Louisiana, was a spokesperson for a lot of very progressive policies, but he was also very much a Southern segregationist politician. And the same is true for the other two, Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi and Eugene Talmadge from the state of Georgia.
Weston?
Yeah, piggybacking off of what Gary's suggesting, I think, the obvious answer is we've had a populist in the White House for the first time since Andrew Jackson, arguably. And so, I mean, the rise of populism in the US in particular, which is being mirrored by a huge number of representatives, of senators, this is clearly a major political force that's growing at the moment, that's receiving a lot of attention on both sides of the aisle, for that matter. And it's important to understand both how this forms, how it exists, how it works, but also this legacy of how little has changed. So much of what was remarkable to me in this research process, which it's the kind of historian's cliche, but you go back and so much has changed and yet so much hasn't. And it's very much an issue of reading through. You can take out some of the overtly, virulently racist remarks made, but with really radically little finagling. Plug in whatever contemporary issue you're looking at, and these speeches could be verbatim things you're seeing on the floors of Congress today. And so establishing this historical legacy, understanding how these figures achieved power in really incredible levels of power, particularly Long, but also Talmadge and Bilbo amassing really incredible, fervent support. It seems really critical to me to understanding what the future of American populism and what this moment that we're in right now is going to look like.
Thank you. We'll get back to certain questions, crucial questions about race, white supremacy, and so on. But I'd like to turn for a moment to the other pillar of your article. That's the theatricality. So you write that the theatricality of the campaign events were central to them. So what do you mean by theatricality in terms of the 1920s and 1930s and up to the 40s, when it was prior to the social web, to the internet, and even at the beginning of their career, films were special, talkies had just come in and so on. So what do you mean by theatricality, and how were they different? In other words, you're writing about three politicians, one from Louisiana, one from Georgia, one from Mississippi, and the South is the same and it's different, as we know. So theatricality and how are each of these politicians, how did they use their theatricality similarly and in a different way? I don't care which of you begins with this. Whoever wants to jump in with that one, please.
Weston, why don't you start?
I'll start, yeah. So in our understanding of theatricality, right, we're looking at elements of costuming, sound, lights, design, and these are highly theatricalized events, right?
So how do they do? Let's just turn to one. I mean, I'll summarize, but when you say costume, what do you mean?
So for Talmadge supporters, right? Talmadge was noted for always wearing these bright red suspenders and a bright red tie. And this became a kind of uniform among, there we go, a kind of uniform among his most ardent supporters. You went to go see him, you knew what he'd be showing up in, and you'd go in that as well. And so there's this audience engagement element of, we're gonna wear that costume, we're gonna come out there as well. We know what we're looking for. Manner of dress was actually really important to all three of them, and the kind of clothes they would wear would be highly selected and something that would recur throughout and be highly recognizable. And so that's one element of where you're seeing this and how it becomes an identifiable mark, both of the politician, but also those who they're really working to turn into this kind of group support for them, right? A big part of this idea of populism is coming into how you build up these identities, particularly in terms of how you build up followers groups, us groups, them groups. And that's a clear and quick way to mark, I'm in with this group, as opposed to I'm out, or I don't know this code, or I don't know what it's going to look like. And there's also an element of Talmadge in particular, again, was really good about receiving what his audience is going to come in. So there's them imitating him and showing up in the suspenders, but there's also, you don't see him with a coat on very often. You know, he's very much the suspenders and a shirt, and if he's got a coat on, it's just to take it off so he can show how sweaty he is and really perform this idea of, I'm down there in the dirt with you. I want to get my hands dirty. I'm sweating every 2 seconds. I'm a farmer like you. And he says, I'm a farmer like you over and over and over. But he also generates these ways of, how do I show that to you? How do I look like you? How do I belong with this group that I'm claiming to be the leader of and among, and at the same time, a little bit better am, because that's why you got to vote for me.
Gary?
Right. Well, I mean, as Richard, as you were indicating, each state is different, and each state has their own particular political culture. But throughout the South, and we're talking about the white electorate, or it's sometimes called the selectorate, because it's done through the Democratic primary. You don't have a solid South as we tend to think of it. You have a very divided South between the urban elites in Atlanta, in New Orleans, in Jackson, Mississippi, who were, you know, those cities, those locations were very much against the politicians that we are writing about. So these politicians represent the white, rural, working class, laboring, farming South. And so in a situation like that, you don't go to the theater, you don't go to movie houses in rural Georgia, rural Mississippi. You go to these kind of events that are set up for you by Senator Bilbo or Governor Talmadge or of course, Huey Long. And that's part of the entertainment that was constructed for them.
So let me dig in a little bit with that and see what you have to say. What about music, food, celebration, and the relationship to the white church? Because populism now, we see it, you know, in terms of the rhythm of their oratory. In other words, the style of their oratory and what they offered when one went to a rally was, you know, it clearly wasn't just an ordinary political meeting where you went and you listened and went home. There was something else going on. And sometimes people would travel quite some distance to get to these things. So the festivity, and the oratorical style, again, what they share and how they are different. I mean, people know Huey Long indirectly through All the King's Men and the movie and the et cetera, et cetera. The others, didn't move into fiction in that kind of way. So music, festivity, et cetera, et cetera. Weston?
Yeah, I mean, music is probably, all of these figures, you know, really invested in, they're going to have music present. They're going to bring out the high school bands. They may have had artists that traveled with them who sang songs to warm them up. And so music is always an element in all three. Long in particular, I think, was the most notable for his utilization of music. He literally commissioned these little books of long songs, or what they were called. And there were like 9 of them in this little pamphlet that would be passed out at the beginning of a rally. And about half were things like the Star Spangled Banner, right? It's something we all know, still remains the same. But half were things that were either written specifically for Huey Long, the most famous by far of which is his, oh Lord, what is the name of the song? It's a Randy Newman song, that is why I know it now. It'll come to me in 5 minutes when I'm no longer talking. but he had a song written that became enormously popular for him, and at the same time would take things like Cole Porter songs and re-lyric them. So they were already popular tunes of the day that you could just hum along with, and you would follow along, much like you're suggesting kind of a prayer book or a hymnal at church, right? And Bilbo in particular, if you want to talk about the element of the white church, is regularly compared to preachers, and his style of rhetoric really is derived from a kind of old school Southern Baptist approach to sermonizing. And if you go through his rhetoric, this is really very clear in, he likes mythology in general, but he likes the kind of rhetoric style, and particularly the timbre is what is usually compared to as being this very, religious experience. And he'll throw in these insults. They all love to throw in really nasty, heinous insults at their rivals. So it's this mix of highbrow and lowbrow. And how they do that is very different with, Long really likes to quote poetry, likes to, turn to kind of classical sources. Bilbo is very much attached to Bible passages. Almost all of his, particularly in his early years, almost all of his speeches use a framework from the Bible, use some element of a religious story to begin with, and then they weave in these digs throughout at their rivals. And so it's a mix of, look at how religious my speech is, how much my speech is tied to classic ideas and that highbrow notion of what we think of as sophisticated, with this notion of, now I'm going to call my opponent a bastard, and really just level that playing field, where I can jump between, look at how highbrow I can get and even make fun of it in some ways, and then right back down to, I'm going to cut them out from underneath their feet.
Gary, anything to add to that about their oratorical style and things?
Well, I think the Long song is "Every Man a King."
Yes.
Okay, and in terms of religion, I mean, Louisiana is different from much of the rest of the Deep South, because for Talmadge and for Bilbo, they are speaking almost entirely to white Protestants, the conservative white church. Long had a different problem because he needed, the northern part of the state was very much like Mississippi, but the bayous in the south are largely Catholic. And so he couldn't rely on that same kind of religiosity that Talmadge and Bilbo did. And Richard mentioned food, and food is an important part of many of these events. Food and liquor, even though the 1920s Klan was very much prohibitionist. It was the kind of thing that you talk prohibition, and then on, the difference between Saturday night and Sunday morning, right? So Sunday morning, you would be a prohibitionist. On Saturday night, there was always moonshine to be had.
All right, let's turn now to race, which is so important. So to remind our viewers, this was the Jim Crow South. This is not the South of Stacey Abrams or Warnock. Lots of things have flipped. So what was what was the function of race in their theatricality? Because you write here, these politicians publicly raised issues of race less to address substantive policy than to raise the emotional heat among their audience. So what do you mean? How did they do this? Et cetera. And then I have some follow-ups on that. But let's, Gary, why don't you go first?
Let me begin, because I'm doing some research on the 1920s Ku Klux Klan, the second Klan, as it's called. And the second Klan, it's very interesting because it's different in the North, in the Midwest, from the South. In the North, the issue, the Klan in the North, the second Klan, is affiliated with the Republican Party. The South, the Klan is different. It is prohibitionist, it is racist, its primary concern is immigration and religion, Catholicism, even more than race per se.
Catholics were the enemy. The
Catholic
Pope, right?
were the enemy because they were, and Jews, because they were flowing into the country. This is like, if you could build a wall on the, outside of New York City to prevent those boats from coming into Ellis Island, these politicians would certainly have done that. And in the South, the Klan in the 20s, and this continued into the 30s, was politically progressive. That is, they represented the working men and women, the white working men and women of the South, the farmers and the laborers. And they were in opposition to the elites, the plantation owners and so forth, particularly in the cities and in the wealthier rural areas. So it's one of the paradoxes. And that the people that we are looking at, racist, they absolutely are, and they would use racism when they needed as a strategy to get elected. But they were also in opposition to the conservative Democrats of the South in the 1920s and 1930s. Long is kind of the iconic case, but it's the same for Bilbo and for Talmadge, who were less honest, less. Long was, I think, a true believer in progressivism. The others probably not so much, but they, in their policies, they represented an opposition to conservatives in their state.
So how did they use race though? How since African Americans were largely shut out from voting, they couldn't have been afraid of the black vote, as it were. It wasn't what Trump was saying about Philadelphia and Atlanta. This is patently the black vote. So how did they use race? How did they use it, and how did they use it theatrically and so on? What was its function?
That's right. I mean, in the South, Jim Crow South, about 5 to 10% of African Americans were able to vote. It was very much local, so that the large proportion were excluded, and they were excluded not because, I mean, there was some opposition to their voting in the general election, but what it was more central was they couldn't vote in the Democratic primary. The Democratic primary was essentially the election. So that's where electoral racism came in the 1920s and 1930s.
For some of the people who are listening, I just want to explain that the huge change in the 60s and 70s of the move of the change of parties, the flip of parties. And to a certain degree, LBJ was the last of the Democratic Southern strong people, and then the flip where Republicans who were, quote, the party of Lincoln at one point, and the party of the Reconstruction became the conservative. That took place around the Nixon era, et cetera, et cetera. So the era that Gary and Weston are talking about, this article, the Democrats were, it was called the Solid South, and it was paradoxical. They always voted Democratic in the general election. They helped elect FDR 4 times, and yet they were fundamentally racists. Yes, just a little bit.
Right. No, absolutely. They were racist. They, even despite that, I mean, they supported Roosevelt's foreign policy, for example. We wouldn't have gotten into World War II had it not been for the solid Democratic support of Roosevelt's foreign policy. I mean,
right.
And in terms of the TVA, and so the Southern politicians would, in many cases, be supportive of the New Deal. Not for all of them, but for many of them, for the Bilbo, for example. But they were, but it was as long as the Roosevelt administration didn't confront race, didn't push on race, which Roosevelt, to his discredit, did not do. I mean, there was basically this, let's call it gentleman's understanding, that you'll vote for our New Deal policies and we will not change the traditions of the South.
Right.
It famously opposed the New Deal, in fact, largely on terms of race, that he was concerned that the New Deal benefits would positively impact Black people, and he lost an election fighting Roosevelt on that point.
Who was this? Which one was this?
Talmadge.
Talmadge. Okay.
And I think to get at your question about how it's utilized, even when, as Gary says, 5 to 10% of Black people can vote in this period, really even less than that in many places in Louisiana. It's really next to nil, particularly given some of the controls that go beyond actual controls. There are legal controls, right? And there are physical threats. And so that's part of this rhetoric, is even the physical threat rhetoric, is you have to go out there and defend the polls. You have to go out there and make sure they can't vote. Even when you have people who have already been systemically oppressed, who have already been denied the ability to vote, that doesn't not make them a cudgel that these people can use. And so you see over and over again this threat of, if you do this, if you support my opponent, then these other people are going to get something. They're going to move ahead. They're going to surpass you. They're going to get benefits that should be going to you. And then there's just flat out, that is the kind of language which we still see very prominently today. The language that's gone away tends to be a lot of racial and ethnic slurs, a lot of just outrageous language that comes out that's really just too appalling to say anything. But that revs people up, right? That kind of, you are different from them. You, white identitarian group, are separate from these people. And to protect that separateness, to protect what you have, to protect your status above them, you have to support me. You have to stay with me so that I can continue to keep you above these other groups.
Mm. Okay, so let's parse out these three a little bit more. So Huey Long was different. The other two are more like each other, or the other two very different from each other? And Huey Long is different from the other two. And Huey Long actually started a family dynasty in Louisiana. In other words, Uncle Earl, when I was there, his brother was governor, and his son Russell Long was a senator. The Long family is still very active in politics. I don't think the Bilbo family, I don't know. I mean, so I'm asking you, they're not all equal in their impact and in their longevity. What separated them out, and why did Long kind of, what made him different? I mean, he also had the shortest career. He was shot in 1935. He never fully, fulfilled his political destiny.
Right. Well, just in terms of the dynasties, the Talmadges were also a dynasty that Eugene Talmadge's son, Herman, was.
Oh, yes.
I think he was governor, but he was senator from Georgia for a period of time. And like the Longs, as the country changed, Herman Talmadge was less racist than his father had been. I mean, still,
Right.
Still part of the segregationist South, but that begins to change in the 50s and 60s.
I think certainly the clearest difference is, I think, what you're hinting at. Long was probably, I don't think it's controversial to say he was the most successful of these three politicians. And I think there's a good case to be made that up until Donald Trump was probably the most successful, maybe with the exception of Bernie Sanders, populist politician, in the last century or something. Long, and part of that is both he held office, but the bigger thing is the way he consolidated power. Huey Long's memory is quite literally set in stone by the huge number of monuments, bridges, hospitals, things that he erected to very much keep himself in memory. But he's way better known in the state for talking about gumbo during a filibuster. Like if you talk to a random person on the street in Louisiana, they will know that story about Huey Long from their 8th grade Louisiana history class.
What is that story? Those of us watching, maybe. We didn't all go to school in New Orleans, so what is the story, the gumbo story?
The gumbo story is that during one of those wonderfully, I think it was at the time record-breaking, I believe it was a 14 or 16-hour filibuster on the Senate floor, went and filibustered for a long, long time. And at this point, was not required to actually talk about the issue he was filibustering. And so at one point starts reading off his mother and grandmother's recipes for gumbo, and just starts telling Congress how to make gumbo. And that was how he stalled for time. But that's the thing, right? Like these kind of stories, this attachment, the way that people, particularly older generations who maybe their parents went to Huey Long, or they were even kids when Huey Long was giving speeches, they remember the eventness of a Huey Long speech, of going to hear Huey Long talk. And he took that kind of cult of personality and built it up. And once he was elected, far more than Bilbo or Talmadge, was able to go in and consolidate power. And he went about a series of structural reforms that really just changed the way that Louisiana politics worked, and made it where he was essentially able to be put in a plant as governor when he went off to be senator, and was just running the state in a near dictatorial manner in a way that's still fairly unrivaled for sheer amount of power by other US politicians. And that's part of what makes Long so unique. And part of what in his memory makes him so unique is he is one of these figures who is reviled or beloved. You got free textbooks from him, he was a tyrant. And so this kind of dichotomy in memory that's still very much an ongoing way in the way that people think of him 70 years on, speaks to how these legacies work.
When I was in New Orleans, people would speak about the medical center and certain things of that, long before there was the talk of universal medical care. Do you think if he hadn't been shot, he could have become president? Could he have gone down that road, or could he have never moved? I guess I'm asking both of you, how much is the populism you're writing about regional and could not be exported? Obviously, Trump has exported a certain kind. He's used Mexico when he did the wall and the rapists and all, instead of the anti-black racism. It was a different kind of racism, although tons of white supremacists support Trump. But do you think that what the governors and senators you're writing about were limited locally, or somebody like Long could have made this a national movement?
Bilbo and Talmadge decidedly not. They never had a national following, right? And part of that is just straight up their level of openly racist rhetoric far exceeded what Long did, which is not to try to couch what Long's level of racism is, but he's more selective, and he gets to be more open about it when he starts to hit a national stage, because he didn't need that in Louisiana as much because of the level of control over democratic politics.
And the other two are more personally corrupt. I mean, Long is corrupt in his own way, but it's not grabbing for dollars in the same way that is true for the other two.
I think, the question of could Long have been president, like as a native Louisianian, I gotta say, like, part of me is like, yeah, we all love to tell each other that. If he hadn't been shot, he would have beaten FDR. The scholar in me is much more skeptical of that. Regardless, I think what's actually really interesting and useful about Long's method of power is really looking at less how much he could have built up the national scale, and more how did he consolidate power in a way that Talmadge and Bilbo didn't. Because the way that he went in and restructured things to really make it where he would gerrymander heavily, he would reset up new boundaries, he reworked elements of the primary, he was guaranteed to continually be elected. And that, I think, is what's really powerful and exportable about that model of populism. That notion of once we achieve power, we're going to rig the whole system to make sure that no matter how small the number of people voting for us is, we maintain that. And that,
I think this is what the Republican Party is doing now, and the state legislators that, in other words, I guess I'm returning to that question, then I have still another one. Is this mode of operation exportable to the whole United States, not appealing, to the populist way of doing things, but also the political manipulations?
Well, I think that Long was a true believer in his policies, and they were quite radical economic policies. And that meant that he had a devoted group of enemies. The various economic elites in this country, I think, would have gathered together to prevent this crazy man. I mean, he wasn't a Marxist as such, but there was some of that element to it. The hatred for Long in New Orleans was palpable. But in the rest of the state, he was quite beloved. Now, whether he could have translated that, it's hard to say. We saw in the 1920s that the Second Klan, which had some of the same elements to it, was a national movement. Whether he could have brought that to the success to get him the presidency, I sort of agree with Weston that it would be unlikely. But he could have been a major national figure without doubt.
Right. Before we open this to our participants, because we're getting close to that, let me ask one more question. The word populism is used often around the world. They talk about, the leaders in India, Hungary, Poland. Do you think it's an appropriate use? Is what you're writing about generalizable in terms of political and performance theory? In other words, both ways, both as a political movement and as a style of public, of politicking. Has it been exported, or is that just a kind of media invention? Weston, let's start with you with that one, and then Gary.
I don't know that I want to claim exporting. That feels to me, which I don't know that I want to. And part of this is I will not claim to have studied populism globally in every context well enough to dig in deeply. But I'll say that things that I've seen with, say, Bolsonaro in India in particular, there is, yes, it is an appropriate use of the term populism. There are incredible overlaps, both in style, both in mannerism, particularly in the idea of how to use technology, how to use mass rallies, these multi, tens of thousands of people. And then during the pandemic, these huge virtual rallies with hundreds of thousands of millions of people attending. That element of rallying, which is interesting because part of the claim of this, as you talk about the theatricality of these events, part of that is very much tied to that notion of being together, feeling that energy, recognizing this group context here, that we are all in this, as part of a group, and that there's something that, magically happens in that kind of communitas that builds up this identity and this linkage of how these groups are made. And so it's interesting to think about. I'm curious about it. I've not dug enough yet into it, but to think of Bolsonaro hosting virtual rallies, or even Trump holding, these kind of quasi-virtual rallies that were going on during the late part of his presidency, and now the things like CPAC, and how that continues to propagate these ideas and to continue to spread them. Is it an exclusively American thing that we're exporting? I think that's probably giving us a bit too much credit. But do these forces that are building globally resemble each other, and are they playing from a similar playbook? Absolutely. That I think that seems very resolved to me.
What's your take on this, Gary?
Well, I think you always have to think in terms of labels of style and content. So we think of Trump as a populist, but we can also think of Bernie Sanders as a populist. I mean, they're both politicians who are very effective in large-scale public events and in getting their supporters emotionally invested in their claims. They have very different policies, of course. And so are they both populists? Well, from a stylistic point of view, we might say that they are. In terms of content, well, it's rather like using a label like socialist. If President Biden is a socialist, and who else are socialists? I mean, it becomes a label that doesn't necessarily have much in the way of meaning. And, populism to some extent is like that, I think.
Thanks. Christian, it's 20 of, or more or less. Are there any questions from our webinar participants?
Indeed, we've got a few to throw out to the panel. The first one that I'd like to ask is from Omnia Ibrahim. So welcome, Omnia, and thank you for your submission. Omnia asks, how should politicians, in your opinion, give a speech that is both attention-grabbing but still a positive message? And are there any differences between the classical speeches given by politicians in the past versus modern day speeches given today? I know that you've sort of touched on lots of these points already, but if there's anything that you want to add there to Omnia's question.
Well, I think it's, again, a question of style versus content. If you take my claim that Bernie Sanders is a populist, you may, if his policies are your policies, you might endorse, the very way he's presenting it, or Bill Clinton, who was very effective. So giving an effective speech is not necessarily giving a speech that is dangerous. And of course, as I pointed out, suggested with these populists, even these Southern populist politicians, that they were railing against the economic elites in their state. So yeah, we can worry about Huey Long, we can worry about the Talmadge and Bilbo, but their enemies were also the enemies of those people who would be considered fighters for the working class.
Yeah, I would agree. I would echo Gary on that. Content and style are the things that we're talking about here, right? Particularly if you're asking, how do you do this in a good way? And that it's, I think looking at the flip side might offer you answers, right? So if we look at Barack Obama, who's kind of a once in a generation politician, particularly because he's working, and you see it very clearly in Biden's message. I don't know if the stylistic success is always present in Biden's speeches, but this message of hope and change for us all that's implied, right? The message of unity, that these are antithetical to a populist idea. There's no breaking up of, look at how bad this person is, look at how terrible these people are. And part of what populism is really good at, right, is grabbing onto that Hillary Clinton line of basket of deplorables and saying they're not any different. It's the exact same. They are breaking up into groups. And so it also wants to demonstrate to you, they think of themselves as a different group. And so I think it's really difficult work. Now, stylistically, you can use many of, as Gary's pointing to, many of the, appeals to classical rhetoric or, different tactics that can be used in great speech making are still applicable, but it's really trying to sidestep that crux of, we are one group, they are another. And we are in this battle of resource, power, cultural capital, whatever it may be, and trying to move on to something that instead says, how do we come together?
Right. I mean, there's this interesting divide between Barack Obama, who is a remarkable politician, and Bernie Sanders, who is also a remarkable politician, but they're very different. Sanders, like the populist we're studying, creates enemies. The billionaire class. And Obama was too cool to do that. It was more hope and change, bring us together. This, maybe it was a certain illusion given the nature of American politics, but it represented a very different kind of speechifying and suggesting that good rhetoric doesn't have to be hostile rhetoric.
Well,
Richard,
Obama had this extraordinary paradox of, quote, being a black man speaking for the people, but more elegant, elite, controlled. You won't get. I mean, it's the substance and the surface, the extraordinary contradictions.
Exactly right. That you couldn't imagine someone like Maxine Waters,
Right.
the California congresswoman, who was very much in that kind of a populist tradition of creating enemies, being successful the way that Obama was.
We've got some really great questions coming through, so I'd like to ask as many of these as possible. The next one is from Sukri Sally Hoglu, so thank you very much for your submission. And Sukri asks, is the origin of populism made in the USA? What do you guys think about that question?
I mean, what we define as populism has movements in multiple countries at around the same time. I think, this is, there's a lot on US historical populism, and I think a lot of scholarship starts there. Again, though, I think that almost gets the idea of a US export, which I'm very cautious about. I think as a political stratagem, I think that's a big claim.
Let me jump in just a little bit. I would say that Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is a populist. That his "lend me your ears" is a perfect populist statement. And therefore, something in the Elizabethan world in the pits understood that, because he wasn't talking to Romans, he was talking to people in the pit. And to turn that crowd from pro to anti Julius, Brutus, was amazing. Brutus was the Obama of the period in a certain way. So I think that we can find these models and demagogues and so on. But certainly if I was to teach it, I would say do Mark Antony's speech and see what happens to that crowd after Brutus and then at the end of Mark Antony's speech.
Absolutely. Tracy Davis has written in to say,
oh, wow. Hi, Tracy.
Could you say more about how populist rhetoric works and has a long tail over time? She's wondering particularly about visual symbolism being invoked in the 1920s and how that may have set precedents.
Thanks, Tracy. I think if we're talking about visual imagery, one of the stark images that I'm reminded of is there's one of Talmadge's inauguration speeches. He stands in front of a battle flag, a Confederate flag. And it's this big flag that's behind him. And there's a series of very old, very white, very Southern looking men surrounding him. And it is one of those images that just kind of sticks in my head of almost a joke on itself, that you look at it and you're like, this is just so over the top how we think of, but that joke exists because of moments like this, right? That idea of that long tail you're hinting at, it has been passed down culturally. Is that what things still look like? No, even at the most conservative rallies today, we don't typically formalized, planned political rallies, not informal protests, not Proud Boys on the street, right, where you absolutely will see these emblems. But politicians who are seeking high office, they're not still using that same visual rhetoric. They may use the American flag in the same way. They may use or borrow elements or have just elements that have lingered over. But it's in the back of our heads. It's something that we know exists culturally because that has continued to be passed down and continues to be recognizable just as something that we see and hear. Gary, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do, because I want to disagree slightly or maybe add slightly, because I think that you see in the Trump rallies something similar. It's not the Confederate battle flag, but it's the MAGA hat. That bright red hat, make America great again. And wearing it means that you are one of us, that you have lent Donald Trump your ears.
Then the January 6th thing, they brought out those Confederate battle flags pretty fast. So they were furled in there at the Trump rally and then displayed as they moved to the Capitol.
Yeah.
And I mean,
I think the battle flag, has some of that feature. It's a little more extreme. That you can get away with wearing a red MAGA hat. You have to be really committed to have a Confederate battle flag.
And what's important to think about on that end, because I think you're totally right, right? But it's also who is depicting it, because the difference of the politician being able to put the battle flag directly behind them versus people bringing it is almost getting a kind of what happens towards the end of Talmadge's era, when he starts to lose popularity and his rallies start getting written up as descending into violence, and there being fisticuffs that are broken out into. And Talmadge loses towards the end of his career whatever power he'd had earlier on. And the rallies start to reflect that as they get more amorphous, less we're all here together, we're all set together, and they start turning more violent. And so you can see, particularly there, that's, in the same way that I would look at Long as perhaps a caution of how one consolidates power through populism, I think the flip side is you can really watch very clearly what populism fizzling out and dying very uncomfortably looks like with Talmadge.
I think we have time for one more question, Christian.
I was just going to try and fit one or two more questions in. Mervyn Horgan, thank you for your question, asks, firstly says thank you for a very fascinating discussion and for the article. But Mervyn wonders if you might discuss briefly some differences between performance in older populism and newer. We've touched slightly on this already, particularly in the context of more fragmented contemporary audiences, thinking of Jeff Alexander's work on problems of a political performer's fusion and diffusion with contemporary audiences. Richard, do you want to take that one?
No.
No.
Gary, what would you say?
I think that one of the things that happens in terms of performance is you have a different media landscape. And, maybe this goes back to Marshall McLuhan, who I read when I was reading Tulane Drama Review. But, that the kind of media format allows for a certain kind of emotionality. That television, as a cool medium, doesn't permit the same kind of, it doesn't promote the same kind of anger that radio does, for instance, as a hot medium. So I would be looking at the ways that people get exposed to performances.
I will jump in and say the internet makes everything hard. Right. The internet is so vast and has changed the way we think about so many things that it's very easy now to pinpoint subgroups within subgroups within subgroups and find the issue they're latched onto. And so in some ways that seems like a real challenge to performance. I think in practice, though, I'm actually curious about how much that works. And I say that because you can talk to or listen to any number of Trump strategists, and they will tell you that pre-pandemic, the strategy was his rallies. The strategy for re-election was to go out and get people together. And an overwhelming majority of the Republican Party post-January 6th is still staunchly in favor of Donald Trump having a major role in their party, possibly even running a second time. And so I think what's interesting is, while yes, the internet changes things and makes us hyper aware of these different groups and how they function and different audiences, at the same time, what's kind of fascinating about the ability of this embodied in-person rally where you all come together and hear the speaker and get on board with what's happening and can respond in the moment with boos and yays and cheers, is it's still a really effective way of building up a mass of people and building that audience that has maybe been shown to be more subdivided than we think of it as, but still will come together to vote when the day comes.
Richard, do you have a final word?
Well, my final word is to thank Gary and Weston enormously for participating in this. And I wish we could have had the time to go further, because the ideas that you've presented about performance, about theatricality, about this living history, as it were, and its relevance to us today is fabulous. And I'm so happy to have your article in TDR. And for those of you who are watching who may not know TDR, this is the kind of thing we do. And we invite you to come and see the journal and read it. And again, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you so much, Weston, and thank you, Cambridge, for hosting us.